So last week in class, we looked at photo collage as a technique for embellishing orthographic elevations and sections. It's a method that could be used for any kind of orthographic drawing. What we're going to be looking at here is actually talking about perspectival drawings, and the reason why this comes up is because we're talking about spatial experiences in Studio. We're also talking about program, which is to say the way that people use a space and the way that they occupy a space. And the tool for that in architecture has traditionally been a perspective drawing. And we're not going to talk about drawing perspectives at this point, but what we are going to talk about is how to use an existing perspective photograph that we have to generate something that acts a lot like a drawing, that it really relies on line to define space, and then we're going to add photographic elements to that to talk about program and narrative and the spatial experience. And this will all become a little bit more clear in a minute. So this particular drawing I have here is by Mies van der Rohe. And it's a sort of pavilion. You can see there's these works of art in it. It's a line drawing basically, right? It's this kind of grid with the suggestion of some columns. It's a very expansive kind of space. It goes off into the horizon, but we're not really sure of where it is or exactly what it's made out of. It's really this abstract space. We can tell it's quite large and quite horizontal. And it has this art in it, and the art is there to give us a sense of the context, to say that this is probably an art gallery or an art museum, and we had these elements in the foreground and in the background to sort of give us a sense of the space. And in some ways, the statues might even suggest, or the paintings might suggest, the scale of the space that we occupy. If they were very large, then it might say that the space might be very small, and if they're very small, the space might be very large. So these pieces of art, these photo, I would say photoshopped, but they're really photo collaged elements. Really embellish the image, and that's kind of the objective that we're going for here. I'll show you some more examples. So another one of Mies van der Rohe's images, and this is idea. You can see this large kind of industrial kind of hangar, and he's just suspended and kind of placed these planes, these abstract planes, and a plinth, and again another piece of art for scale. And it's about making us, just by adding these elements to this, we're thinking about the space differently, about the way we might occupy it differently, about the activities that might happen in that space. And this is a really, so this is not only as a way to communicate our intention to a client, but as a way to sort of dream and speculate about spaces. And architects in particular are very sensitive to these kinds of images because they can really evoke a lot of ideas, for us. So this will be part of your design process as well. And the photo collage technique is nice because it's usually very rapid. Again, it's very abstract, so it's almost like a diagram of the way the space is going to be used, and it can really help you in your design process. And also because it uses a lot of photographs, it's something that people who are not architects can sort of find a way into. So I think it's really effective that way. It's an image by Superstudio. This is taking this image of a man on a boat in a beach and kind of superimposing this structure into it with the city beyond, and it's a piece of architecture that's inserted into our reality, inserted into the photograph, that changes our relationship to that reality, or it adds a spatial component that wasn't there before. It adds an architectural component that changes the space. So it might be a wall, it might be a canopy, it might be a facade, it might just be a form, but it's now a threshold, it's now a barrier, it's a frame. And it's just this idea that even in architecture, we can insert these elements into the landscape or into our cities, and they change that. And so this is a really evocative piece to show that. Another Superstudio's things. This is a project called the Super Surface, and it's this idea that just long plane, this long grid that just stretches on forever through the landscape. And so here you can see the kind of photographic elements of the water's edge and this kind of cliffside and this kind of rubble pile, and here are these hippies having a picnic on this surface, right? The surface has created a space for them to drink their wine and kind of have their party. And this juxtaposition of things that are kind of real with things that are surreal, is really fertile ground for thinking about new architectural experiences. This is really unusual, right? You wouldn't actually do this, but it might cause you to think about a different way to occupy a space. And again, it's a very evocative kind of image, but it's very minimal, right? Like, this is just a simple line drawing, couple of things cut out, at this point in time with an X-Acto knife and glued on, but juxtaposing those elements together, the landscape, the architecture, and the human, creates a narrative about what's happening. Another Superstudio. So this is one of these platforms again in the desert, and now there are these kinds of stations where people can plug in like electronics, and then there's kind of foliage dispersed throughout. And again, it's just this really kind of radical kind of image of architecture. It's kind of science fiction-y. This is just meant to evoke, ideas and a sense of space and a sense of use. Another Superstudio. So we've moved the surface, through the desert. Now it's in the mountains, and we're seeing our infrastructure. And there's this family of women. I'm not sure what they're doing, but it gives you a sense of like that there are people using it, and maybe a sense of the scale of it. Another Superstudio. So there's this housewife on this scrap of carpet with a push mower and an ironing board and a young child. Maybe it's a doll. I'm not sure. But just the idea that, like, imagine it's almost like the Matrix, or it's like the holodeck or something, right? That there's this expanse, this grid, and there's nothing but the sky. And then within this is this island of activity, of like domesticity, and it's a little kind of absurd, but it is definitely spatial. What if this is your house, right? ARCAgram, so similar to Superstudio, they're doing a lot with images and drawings together. Here, this is this kind of like, I don't want to call it, it's kind of a city within a city. These kind of structures that have been added, some of them are inflatable. There's like billboards, cranes, like more inflatable habitats put into the highway. And the color that's added to them makes them really pop. You've got your 1960s, 1970s people kind of walking through. These people are drawn in the background for scale, but then the photographed elements, giving you the kind of foreground. But it's just this really whimsical, fantastical, again, city within a city. I mean, just taking all the highways that we normally experience, how we get around a city, and just inserting architecture into it all over the place to make it a space. Like she's actually walking, through the city now. It's not just the sidewalk of the like freeway. Just the same image, just kind of blown up. So you can see the kind of like the suburbs like aligned, like running right into the freeways that are overlapping each other, and there's all this like these stages and this like, it's almost like a like where the space shuttle takes off from, right? It's this piece of infrastructure that kind of activates the city with like electronics and like inflatable habitats and things. And again, it's just making us kind of think about another way to relate to the city. Collage and OMA. This is an old project. The voluntary prisoners of architecture. It's this idea of a wall, kind of like the Berlin Wall, that instead of being a place that you would not want to occupy or that you would try to escape from, would be a place that you would want to escape to. You'd become a prisoner of architecture, like voluntarily. So, and he talks about like how you would come to like arrive at this wall, and you'd go through this like checkpoint, and so you see the kind of images, but he's drawn this wall, right, and this very ornate, kind of rest area made out of marble, and anyway, just sort of evoking this idea of a space and what happens there, without actually drawing it or building it, just really representing it. Later on, he would go on to do the Seattle Public Library, which I think most of you guys are familiar with at this point, but most people haven't seen this. Is that these are some of the drawings that he used to propose the Seattle Public Library, and they are pretty crazy. If you look at these images here, Yes, this is the ceiling. This is the kind of curtain wall system on the edge, and these are the planes that people would sort of move through in the space as he envisioned it. But look at this, like he just fills it with like these crazy children. You know, they're not even in like perspective, like necessarily, just piles of books and bookshelves on the wall, and just this cutout image of the city. I mean, it's not extremely well done. You know, it doesn't look like a rendering. It doesn't look like the space. But what it does is it tells us a sense of what he's planning for it, that it's this accelerator of activity. It's not a boring library. It's a space where people are going to come together with technology and socialize, you know, as opposed to just simply, you know, read in a dusty library. And you look at all these things. I mean, the people on the lawn, you know, doing like yoga or passed out. You know, like they're just, this is his lobby, and there's a guy skateboarding off of this. These people looking through this window at the mountains, and I think there's a Starbucks over there, and you know, there's people in this reading room like falling. This information bar, you know, just really like mashing up and mixing up these tropes of the library, but also new ways of thinking about how people use space. Like, what if you could skateboard in a library? You know, what kind of space would that be? Like, what kind of library would that be? He's challenging us, you know, and he's making a really provocative statement, you know, with that. This is the reading room. This is upstairs. It's a well-known space in the real building. But look at what he's done. It's this simple, arguably kind of crummy digital rendering. Look, the book stacks are just little volumes, and he's just shown us the kind of, there's no structure, it's just volume and screen. And the buildings next to it are these simple kind of block representations as well. But what he's really done really nicely is he's shown us the sound in Seattle and how this would open up onto this very large view, this very expansive view, and then there'd be this little cafe, right? And you would sit on this plinth, and you'd have a view of the books, and you'd have a view of the sound, and, you know, I think it's Mount Rainier, you know, like from a long ways away. And if you've been there, this is pretty much what it is. Like he's talking about it in a very minimal kind of way, but because he's making the architecture just this simple drawing, he's not trying to render it. The photographs really have an emotional kind of connection, an emotional pull. This is a spatial experience within a drawing, and that's what we're kind of going for. Another of Koulas's renderings. You can tell I like Koulas a lot. This is his proposal for MoMA, which was not successful. But you can see these great things. Like he actually has a drawing that he made of you driving past the building in your car, and the car is in the foreground. You can see the rearview mirror just kind of hovering there, and this big open space that he envisions. You know, and he's not showing us how he's doing it. He's just evoking it. This big like piece of material, just a simple line drawing. It says Museum of Modern Art, but he wants us to think of this as this big open plaza, like on this edge. That the building levitates basically, and that's what he's done. Then he talks about the relationship between, you know, these kinds of dining areas and presentation areas, and like into this lobby space. Simple presentation of colored planes. Couple of elements to give us the middle ground, gentlemen dining in the foreground. Like we have a sense of the mood that he wants, a sense of like how the space works, a sense of how the program works, but with a minimal effort. Here's a gallery. Oops, skipped ahead there. It's a gallery with a painting and some people. Again, foreground, middle ground, background. The room just open without columns, or maybe with the bare, I'm not sure if these are trees or columns, but the barest suggestion of structure, because he just wants it to feel open. This is a collage, but it's really dealing with these volumes that he's built in a digital model, but they're extremely abstract volumes. This is my favorite images. This is a moving platform that takes you through the building. So instead of an escalator or an elevator, you would get on this platform and it would move you through the space at an angle. So not only are you moving up and down as you would, but you're also moving through space, and you're moving through these big open galleries that I've talked about, or they've shown, like these big open spaces, you know, zipping past the art, you know, standing in this big space that it's not an elevator, you know, it's the floor. the floor is moving from space to space. Very minimal drawing, very simple architectural looking kind of figures cut out of magazines or from online. But it gets the job done in a really, really evocative way. Better than like an image, I think, of the actual thing could. And that's it. So the idea of this piece is to try to think of these ways to take an existing image or images that you have, talk about them as a new spatial experience or as a way to exaggerate that spatial experience using the kinds of techniques that I'm about to show you. But again, the idea of these is that they're all perspectival, right? They're all from a viewer's perspective. They talk about a particular kind of event that's happening or like a program, so some activity, whether it's a cafe or a gallery, and they evoke a spatial experience, like whether it's expansive or compressed or like vertical or protected, and they do so through these images. And a lot of times they're kind of whimsical and they're really like evocative of a particular mood. There might be a juxtaposition of different things, like skateboarding in the library, but it's meant to spark the imagination in a way that other styles of architectural drawing, like we've been doing so far, right, really can't do, because they're too concerned with reality, with representing what is really there. And here we're purely speculating. So anyway, hopefully this gives you a little bit of food for thought. I'll put these slides up online, and if you guys have any questions, let me know. I will see you in part 2.